Imagine it's 1st November 1923. You are a 41-year-old school teacher living in Berlin, Germany. You rent a modest apartment near Alexanderplatz with a coal stove in the kitchen and two children asleep behind a curtain. You have years of wages saved in a bank book, enough, you once believed, to carry your family through sickness, old age, and any hard winter that might come. Each Friday you stop at the bakery, buy dark bread, a little sausage, and a newspaper, then walk home counting coins in your coat pocket. Your husband repairs shoes on the ground floor, and between his workbench and your classroom salary, life still feels narrow but manageable. You are not rich, but you are careful, and careful people are supposed to survive. If you have ever wondered why inflation seems to hit the people in the middle with special cruelty, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before, in different languages, on different continents, under different flags, and if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then, before the school bell rings, you hear the new price of bread. On this very day, 1 pound costs 3 billion marks. A glass of beer costs 4 billion. 1 pound of meat costs 36 billion. Your savings did not vanish in a robbery. They dissolved in plain sight like ink dropped into boiling water. This is what this video is about. Not just inflation as a rise in prices, but inflation as a transfer system, a quiet machine that often drains the middle class while protecting, and sometimes enriching, those who own the right assets, owe the right debts, or stand close enough to the money spigot. The point is not that every rich person wins and every middle-class family loses. History is messier than that. The point is that when money starts losing value, the rules of the game change unevenly. And the people who live by wages, savings, pensions, and fixed salaries are usually the last to be told. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Inflation is not just a higher number on a grocery bill. It is a change in who gets hurt first and who gets time to adapt. Think of money as a measuring tape. If the tape keeps stretching while you are still building the house, every promise written in inches becomes suspect. Your wage says one thing, your rent says another, your savings account says a third. Nothing lines up. And when the measuring tape itself is moving, the people closest to real things such as land, factories, inventory, stocks, foreign currency, or fixed-rate debt can adjust faster than the people whose entire lives sit inside numbers on paper. That is the core mechanism. Inflation erodes the value of cash and fixed payments. It also erodes the real value of fixed debt. In plain English, if you borrowed yesterday and prices jump today, you may repay that loan with money that buys less than the money you borrowed. That is why inflation often shifts wealth from holders of money and bonds to holders of assets and debtors. But there is a second layer, and this is where the middle class gets squeezed. Middle class families usually earn money slowly and spend it quickly. Their wealth is often trapped in salaries, bank deposits, pensions, insurance policies, and maybe one home. Richer households, by contrast, are more likely to own businesses, shares, rental property, commodities, or land, and those things tend to move with inflation or even ahead of it. So inflation is not a storm that falls evenly on everyone. It is more like a rising tide inside a tilted room. Some people feel it at their ankles. Others are already standing on the furniture. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. Weimar Germany is remembered for wheelbarrows full of cash, but the most important detail is not the absurdity. It is the sorting mechanism. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money becomes worthless faster than people can spend it, did not just make everyone poorer in the same way. It split society by balance sheet. The old middle class, especially people who had done everything they were told to do, save cash, buy bonds, trust institutions, was hit like a pane of glass struck by a hammer. They had claims on money. Money itself was the thing failing. By late 1923, the exchange rate reached about 4.2 trillion marks to $1. Workers were often paid twice a day because wages could lose value by lunchtime. Families ran from factory gates to shops before price tags changed again. The floor did not collapse all at once. It liquefied beneath their feet. One moment a bank book looked like safety. The next it looked like a museum label for a lost civilization. And yet, while savers were being destroyed, parts of the debtor class were being rescued. A modern study of German firms during the inflation found that highly indebted companies saw their real debt burdens collapse. Their bankruptcies fell. Their employment held up better. Their shareholders in heavily leveraged firms outperformed owners of low-debt firms by roughly 10 to 13% a year during the inflation. That sounds technical, so let us say it plainly. If you were a disciplined school teacher with cash savings, inflation punished you. If you owned a business with fixed debt tied to real assets, inflation could quietly wipe your debt down to dust. This is the part many people miss. Inflation does not only raise prices, it changes the weight of past promises. The mortgage, the bond, the savings account, the pension, the insurance policy, each one becomes heavier or lighter depending on which side of the contract you stand on. In Weimar Germany, bankers, bondholders, and cash savers were the ones holding ice in a furnace. Owners of real assets, especially those carrying debt, held something closer to stone. Ordinary people felt this in humiliating ways. The middle class, which had once defined itself by thrift, education, and self-control, found that thrift had become a trap. Respectability had no exchange rate. One source from the period notes that confidence in liberal institutions cracked badly among the middle class because the people who had held cash savings and bonds were ruined. The lesson was brutal. In an inflation spiral, prudence without protection becomes self-sacrifice. Now here is where it gets interesting. The people who looked safe before the inflation were often the least safe once it began. A salary paid monthly was slower than prices. Savings in the bank were slower than prices. A pension fixed on paper was slower than prices. But a landlord collecting rents on real property, a merchant holding inventory, or an industrialist with large nominal debts could move with the fire or even feed on it. Inflation was not a pickpocket, it was a locksmith. It opened some doors at the exact moment it sealed others. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When prices rise fast, what matters more? How hard you work or what form your wealth is stored in? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads to the second part of the story, and this time the setting is not post-war Europe, but Argentina at the end of the 1980s. In Buenos Aires, hyperinflation did not arrive dressed like a dramatic historical photograph. It arrived as routine. A trip to the supermarket, a pension check, a monthly salary, a queue on the sidewalk, a calculator in the hand. By 1989 and 1990, Argentina's average annual inflation was about 2,600% in both years. In July 1989 alone, monthly inflation hit about 196.6%. That is not normal inflation. That is gravity being rewritten. One New York Times report from June 1989 captured the madness inside a Buenos Aires supermarket. The manager said prices were losing 1% of their value every 4 hours. In the last week alone, food prices had jumped 27%. Banks were paying about 2% daily interest to depositors, and even that was not enough to keep up. The most important sentence in that report was also the simplest. Salaries did not rise 1% every 4 hours. That single gap explains almost everything. Prices can move now, wages move later, savings sit still. The middle class lives inside that delay. They are the bridge between fixed income and moving prices. And when inflation accelerates, the bridge becomes a treadmill. Look at what happened next. As prices surged, panic buying spread, food riots and looting broke out. 15 people were killed, around 80 were wounded, and roughly 1,700 were arrested. Supermarkets became battlefields, not because bread disappeared from the earth, but because money stopped performing its quiet social job. It no longer told people what things were worth from one day to the next. Once that measuring stick starts bending, trust drains out of everyday life like air from a punctured tire. But even in this chaos, some people learned to work with the current instead of against it. A Los Angeles Times report from early 1990 described how Argentines tried to survive. Some bought dollars the moment they were paid. Some stocked their homes with food because groceries held value better than savings accounts. One 66-year-old retiree, Rosa Juarez, said she and her husband used most of their pension to buy dollars at the start of the month, then changed small amounts back each day in order to live. If not, you lose everything, she said. That sentence could be engraved over every inflation crisis in history. And notice the social split. Rich or middle-class Argentines with access to dollars, foreign accounts, inventory, or goods they could reprice had options. Poorer workers did not. The same report described how many people from the lower middle class down simply had nothing left to invest in anything. No dollars, no cushion, no extra groceries, no second chance. Inflation widened the gap between people who could convert paper into something harder and people who could not. There was also a quiet reward for those with working capital and supplier credit. One supermarket manager explained the trick with remarkable honesty. Sell first, pay later. Goods came in on Thursday, he sold them on Friday, he paid suppliers on Tuesday. In other words, inflation turned timing into profit. Holding inventory for even a few days could beat holding money. That is not a small difference. That is a whole economic class system hidden inside the calendar, and this is where history gets uncomfortable. Inflation is often described as a general rise in prices, as if society climbs the hill together. But Argentina shows something darker. Some people run uphill wearing boots. Others do it barefoot. Those who could reach dollars, goods, or fast-turning businesses suffered less. Those who lived on fixed pensions, weekly wages, or cash in a bank were slowly skinned by the clock. The richer you were, the more likely you were to own something that moved. The more ordinary your life was, the more likely your money stood still. Now observe the third case, because by this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Zimbabwe in 2007 and 2008 pushed the logic of inflation to an almost surreal extreme. The government's own estimate put inflation at 66,000% in 2007. By June 2008, annual inflation was over 11 million%. By mid-November 2008, economists Steve Hanke and Alex Kwok estimated monthly inflation at 79.6 billion% and annual inflation at 89.7 sextillion%. When numbers reach that scale, language itself starts to sound broken. Yet daily life was brutally concrete. Prices were revised hourly, or even faster. In some stores, goods were quoted in Zimbabwe dollars and US dollars at the same time. The famous $100 trillion banknote was not a symbol of wealth. It was a tombstone for a currency. Reuters reported unemployment at over 90%. Food shortages, fuel shortages, and medicine shortages haunted daily life. Millions fled. Savings and pensions were wiped out. A lifetime of careful effort was turned into confetti by a printer. The mechanism was the same as before, only faster. The government financed itself by creating more money. More and more currency chased the same or fewer goods. Trust in the local currency collapsed. And once people no longer believed the money would hold value even for a few hours, they rushed into anything else. Foreign currencies, goods, fuel, airtime, livestock, anything that could store value better than paper. An important study on Zimbabwe found that foreign currencies rapidly replaced the Zimbabwe dollar in daily life. The US dollar, the South African rand, the Botswana pula, the Zambian kwacha, and the Mozambican medical all became common. Shopkeepers updated prices based on black market exchange rates. Within weeks, the economy spontaneously dollarized, which means people simply abandoned the local currency in practice. That was the public's verdict. When the ruler is crooked, people bring their own ruler. Once again, who suffered most? Salaried workers paid in local currency. Pensioners, families with cash, small businesses without access to hard currency. And who endured better? People with foreign income, traders who could source goods across borders, those with relatives abroad sending stronger money, and anyone who could get out of local cash quickly. Even in a national collapse, access to the right asset separated pain from ruin. There is a line from an NPR interview during the Zimbabwe crisis that captures the cruelty perfectly. If you had been prudent and left money in a bank account or under a mattress, you could go from well off to broke in a couple of years. That is the middle-class tragedy in one sentence. The very behavior that looks responsible in stable times becomes suicidal in unstable ones. Inflation turns the safety manual upside down. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In Germany, the saver lost while the indebted owner of real assets often saw debt evaporate. In Argentina, salaries lagged, pensions shrank, and people with dollars or inventory stayed ahead. In Zimbabwe, the local currency died in public, and those with access to foreign money survived the wreck better than those trapped in wages and savings. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Inflation is not just about prices going up. It is about time moving at different speeds for different classes. The price of bread updates now. The salary updates later. The pension maybe updates next year. The mortgage was fixed yesterday. The rent gets renegotiated next month. A stock portfolio jumps this afternoon. A checking account sits there like a sleeping guard on a collapsing wall. Inflation is a race in which not everyone hears the starting gun at the same moment. And that is why the middle class is so exposed. The poor often own very little and suffer immediately, which is its own deep tragedy. The rich often own things that move with the inflation or hold debts that shrink with it, but the middle class stands in the doorway. They have enough to lose, but not enough power to outrun the system. They save in local banks. They plan in local currency. They trust fixed contracts. They believe in gradual improvement. Inflation punishes exactly those habits. There is also a psychological dimension. The middle class is built on deferred reward. Study now, benefit later, save now, spend later, work now, retire later. Inflation attacks the word later. It brings tomorrow's value into question. It tells the careful family that patience is for fools and speed is for winners. That is why inflation corrodes more than purchasing power. It corrodes character, trust, and the moral link between effort and outcome. It is acid rain on the roof of social order. Now here is the quiet part. In less dramatic forms, the same pattern can appear without wheelbarrows or trillion-dollar notes. A society does not need hyperinflation to create a transfer from people who hold money to people who hold assets. It only needs prices to rise faster than wages and savings, while asset values lift faster than both. The theater changes. The script does not. This brings us to the human cost and to the quieter versions of the same old story. Who gets hurt first? The pensioner with fixed income? The teacher whose salary is reset once a year? The nurse with savings in a bank account? The office worker saving for a house while house prices move faster than pay? The small shop owner who cannot buy inventory in advance? The renter whose monthly check must chase a market that reprices faster than labor does? They are not standing still because they are lazy. They are standing still because the ground under them is moving. Who walks away fine, or at least less damaged? The person who owns scarce assets, the business that can reprice quickly, the landlord with debt fixed in yesterday's money, the exporter paid in stronger currency, the investor whose portfolio rises when asset prices rise, the family with access to dollars, land, commodities, or a business with pricing power, which means the ability to raise prices without losing customers immediately. Inflation is a furnace that does not burn every material at the same temperature. History gives us the extreme cases, but the modern rhyme can be quieter and therefore easier to miss. In the United States, consumer inflation reached 13.5% in 1980, the worst annual rate in decades. Families with fixed savings and fixed incomes felt that squeeze sharply, while homeowners with long-term fixed mortgages saw the real burden of their debt shrink as nominal incomes and prices rose. More recently, the Federal Reserve found that after the start of 2020, U.S. households gained more than $18 trillion in wealth, and nearly 80% of that gain came from rising asset prices rather than new saving. In plain English, a huge share of the wealth increase came because existing assets got more expensive. But who owned those assets? That is the question that matters. The same Federal Reserve work found that the bottom half of households saw fast percentage growth in wealth during the pandemic period, yet they received only 3.3% of the total wealth gain because they owned so little to begin with. For the top 1%, nearly 90% of their wealth gain came from corporate equities, which simply means stocks or ownership shares in companies. Another Federal Reserve Bank study showed that the top 1% of households hold nearly half of their investment mix in equities. And federal data show the top 1% own roughly half of corporate equities and mutual fund shares. So when asset prices rise, the gains do not fall from the sky like equal rain. They land where the ownership already is. Now pair that with the experience of ordinary savers. The St. Louis Fed noted that in March 2022, the average U.S. checking account paid about 0.03%, while inflation was running at 8.5%. That meant the purchasing power of money sitting in checking accounts fell by about 8.47% in a year. Again, no wheelbarrow, no trillion-dollar note, just quiet erosion. Quiet enough to sound normal, quiet enough for people to mistake a transfer for a trend. This is why inflation often feels unfair, even when the headline number looks abstract, because it is not only about more expensive eggs or rent. It is about different classes holding different kinds of claims on the future. The middle class tends to hold promises. The rich tend to hold things. Promises are fragile in an inflation. Things are sturdier. A pension statement is a photograph. A warehouse full of goods is a moving vehicle. Argentina offers some especially painful close-up shots of this process. As inflation accelerated, wholesalers tightened credit brutally. Instead of allowing stores to pay in 30 days, many wanted cash or payment within 48 hours. That sounds like a detail. It was not. It meant that big chains with working capital could still keep shelves stocked, while smaller shops began to suffocate. Inflation did not only raise prices for the customer, it pulled oxygen from the business world itself. If you were a neighborhood grocer without spare cash, you were not just fighting higher costs. You were fighting time, and ordinary life became smaller. In that same period, one Argentine kiosk owner described cigarette prices rising 50%, then 6%, then another 77% in less than 3 weeks. He said he had to sell 3 packs just to buy one new pack for the shelf. That is not commerce anymore. That is a snake eating its own tail. Another man said he could no longer afford to drive his car because fuel prices had become absurd. A shopper explained that her family's entertainment had become going to the supermarket. That line matters because inflation does not usually announce itself as catastrophe at first. It arrives as subtraction. First the restaurant, then the weekend trip, then the new shoes, then the car stays in the garage, then even the grocery list becomes a battlefield. The middle class is especially vulnerable to that slow shrinking because middle class life is made of recurring obligations: school fees, insurance, commutes, rent or mortgage, a modest holiday, repairs, savings for children. Or none of these look dramatic on their own, but together they form a tight machine. Inflation throws sand into every gear at once. The worker who earns a little too much to qualify for help, but not enough to outrun price changes, often becomes the silent loser. History is full of visible poor and visible rich. Inflation creates invisible poor in the middle first. There is also a counterintuitive fact here, and it is important. Inflation does not always reward only the already rich. Sometimes it helps borrowers with fixed debt, including middle-class homeowners. The St. Louis Fed has pointed out that unexpected inflation can transfer wealth from creditors to debtors, including younger households carrying fixed-rate mortgages. That means a family who already owns a home with a long mortgage may feel a kind of hidden relief while a renter saving in cash feels crushed. This does not weaken the main pattern. It sharpens it. The divide is not simply rich versus poor. It is asset holder versus cash holder, debtor versus creditor, fast-moving balance sheet versus slow-moving paycheck. And yet, across history, wealthier households still tend to be positioned better because they own more of the assets that reprice first, and they have more ways to respond. Federal Reserve research on the United States shows that the bottom 90% depend much more heavily on a primary residence for their wealth, while the top 10% are more diversified. They hold more wealth outside the family home. Diversification is just a complicated word for not having your whole life in one basket. When inflation or asset repricing hits one corner of the economy, the family with 5 doors out is safer than the family with one. Now think about what that means in a quieter inflation, the kind that does not produce headlines about trillion-dollar notes. If stocks rise sharply, the already wealthy benefit most because they own most of the stocks. If housing rises sharply, existing owners benefit while first-time buyers fall behind. If wages rise more slowly than either one, the middle class gets squeezed from both sides, like a book pressed between closing shelves. This is one reason inflation can feel so politically toxic even when employment looks decent on paper. People are working, but the distance between work and security keeps widening. That widening gap is not just financial, it changes behavior. In inflationary societies, people become amateur traders because they have to. Teachers track exchange rates, retirees learn street currency markets, parents rush to buy food in bulk after payday. Small businesses spend as much time on pricing as on selling. Human attention, which should go into building better lives, gets dragged into defensive maneuvers. Inflation steals hours before it steals houses. So who gets hurt the most over and over again? Not only the poor, though they suffer terribly. Not only the reckless, though they suffer too. The answer is often the rule followers with delayed dreams, the family halfway to a down payment, the pensioner with a fixed check, the civil servant with a careful budget, the clerk with emergency savings, the small entrepreneur without access to dollar credit. These are the people standing in the doorway when the fire moves through the hall. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record shows that those who came through inflationary periods with the least damage largely shared a few characteristics. First, they did not let all of their life savings remain in the weakest form of money available to them. In Argentina, families rushed into dollars or even groceries because groceries kept value better than Australis. In Zimbabwe, people shifted into foreign currencies as soon as they could. In Weimar Germany, owners of real assets and businesses with debt were far less exposed than savers sitting on paper claims. The exact asset differed. The principle did not. They moved from melting ice to harder ground. Second, they had some kind of pricing power or speed. Merchants who could sell today and pay suppliers later used time itself as a shield. Employers who could reset prices faster than wages had room to breathe. Exporters earning stronger currencies were less trapped. Even households that survived best often behaved like tiny traders. They spent weak money quickly, converted it fast, or stored value in goods rather than in local cash. They understood, instinctively or painfully, that inflation rewards motion. Third, they distrusted comforting language. They did not assume that because the government called the currency stable, it was stable. They did not assume that because a bank balance looked large, it was safe. They watched what money could buy, not how many zeros were printed on it. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the hardest lessons in history. Human beings are attached to face value. Inflation punishes that attachment. Notice what I'm not saying. I am not telling you what to buy. I am not offering a formula. This is historical and educational analysis, not a shopping list. Different periods had different winners. In some places it was land. In others it was dollars. In others it was inventory, debt, or access to foreign trade. The lesson is not a product, the lesson is pattern recognition. People who survived inflation best usually had flexibility, speed, and something real outside the local money used to price everything around them. And there is one more trait worth mentioning. They adapted emotionally. That sounds soft, but it matters. Inflation breaks habits before it breaks budgets. It tells people that the routines which built their lives no longer work. The survivors were often those who accepted the change early, even if they hated it. They did not stand in the rain arguing with the weather. They looked for shelter. So let us return to that teacher in Berlin. She did not become reckless. She did not become lazy. She did not suddenly forget how to live responsibly. The world around her changed its measuring system. Her bank book, once a symbol of discipline, became a fossil. By the time the Rentenmark was introduced to stabilize Germany's currency, the money she had spent years saving had already been hollowed out. The tragedy was not only economic, it was moral. She had played by the rules of a stable society during a period when the rules themselves had been dissolved. That is the deeper lesson running through Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and quieter modern episodes as well. Inflation is never just a number. It is a pressure that reveals who lives on paper, who lives on assets, who can move fast, who must wait, who holds debt, who holds cash, and who gets to rewrite prices before everyone else can rewrite their budgets. History shows that the middle class is often squeezed not because it is weak, but because it is structured around delayed reward in a world where inflation attacks delay itself. So when people say inflation hurts everyone, that is true only in the broadest and least useful sense. A flood also hurts everyone. But the person on the hill and the person in the basement are not having the same experience. Inflation crushes the middle class when savings, wages, and pensions lag behind the cost of living. It quietly rewards the rich when wealth is stored in assets that rise, in debts that shrink in real terms, or in businesses that can move prices faster than households can move their paychecks. Different country, different decade, same mechanism. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.